these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. This is a great episode we have in store for you, and I don't think my guest needs a really big introduction. He's the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being on this really great show. Good to have you.
Dan, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on. We'll have a good time today and hopefully be informative too.
I think it will. Look, like everybody in the Trump administration, you were derided by the left-wing media as I think the New York Times called you the worst Secretary of State ever. But as you have said, you should take that with a badge of honor because you know what, they say that about everybody, and it's also just not the case. It's really. I mean, I think one of the forgotten and unappreciated moments of the Trump presidency, and you had just so much to do with this, was the wins on foreign policy, and you were the architect of that, and that's what we want to talk about today in our limited time. But I do want to give people some background on you because everybody knows you as Secretary of State. But you were also, you went to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. You were an armor and cavalry officer as well, which is, that's fine. That's fine. It's not, it's okay. It's not, we can forgive you.
Yeah.
You were in the House before you were tagged by President Trump to be director of the CIA. That's a fascinating thing too. I'd love to talk about. But and then of course you went on to be Secretary of State. And did a fantastic job there. So there's a few things we want to talk about today. One is what's going on in Iran. New president elected. I don't think a lot of people are following that. I definitely want to ask you about China and how we should be thinking about our strategy over the next 5 years, over the next 50 years towards China. And but I also want to actually start with what it's like. I mean, because this is probably something you're not asked that often. What is it like to be Secretary of State? What do you go in the office doing every day? Is it just like Madam Secretary? Are you like Tia Leone? So just give us an overview. I mean, tell us what it was like. What was the first day like?
Yeah, my politics are a little different than hers too. So lots of things that are different, I think. Dan, I had seen it a little bit, so it wasn't brand new to me in the sense of, by the time I became Secretary of State, I had been the CIA director, so I'd been part of the Trump National Security Team for a year and a half at this point. And before that, I'd been in Congress like you are today, so I'd had a chance to interact with diplomats, Foreign Service officers, State Department officials, so I had a little sense of it. But there's nothing like showing up. It is a workforce that amounts to almost 70,000 people, 180 plus countries around the world. 3 workforces, 3 unions inside the building. So so every day that you're in Washington, I would show up early. I would read the intelligence materials that had been prepared, and then it was on to a briefing on the things that were of the moment, the crisis of the day, if you will. Mm-hmm. And then I always had time in every day to work on the things that were really a priority for President Trump. Pushing back and confronting, beginning to develop a strategy for the next decade to push back against the Chinese Communist Party. We worked hard on reducing our Middle East profile and getting greater peace there. It resulted ultimately in some good outcomes with the Abraham Accords, but our understanding of the Middle East and how we were going to approach it was very different than previous administrations as well. We focused on religious freedom. There were just a bunch of things that we worked on. And so, you have a big team, you have a big staff around you. It is easy to become isolated. And I worked every day to make sure I was down talking to everybody throughout the building. So I understood really what the pulse and the capability of the team was to deliver for the president.
And I definitely want to talk about Abraham Accords. I think, again, underappreciated win for the administration and you personally. So, but I want to, one question that's burning for me though is, look, I know full well. I mean, I did my master's degree at Harvard at the Kennedy School. I went to Tufts. This is the kind of graduates that go into the State Department, and they don't like me, and they don't like you know, they don't like my politics. So I mean, and this gets to a broader question about, you know, the so-called, I don't like the word deep state. I don't it does, you know, but it does, there is something to it.
Oh,
In the
Dan,
sense,
there is. Absolutely.
in the sense that, look, there's political bias amongst, especially political appointees. Could we have done a better job of flushing out at least political appointees? And how do we fix that problem with the political bias in a lot of our institutions in federal government?
Dan, you've nailed an important problem, something I'm going to continue to work on. And I have an idea for something I might write about this too. It was the case. The State Department is absolutely an organization that is filled with, you described the people, right? They come from Georgetown, they come from SAIS at Johns Hopkins, they come from Tufts. These are people that don't share your and my worldview. These are people who are left of center or further, with exceptions, but the workforce itself is a statist workforce, right? These are career government officials. And it's not that there weren't great people, there absolutely were. But boy, the resistor, especially when someone comes in like President Trump, who doesn't come from government, who says, well, let's go try something that is different or unique. The weight of the flywheel to get it spun up, to actually take bold action is enormously difficult. I have a number of ideas about how we could respond to this. You hit on one of them. We were slow to get our team on the field. We were slow to identify political appointees, get them vetted, get them ready, get them through the Senate confirmation process, and get them out to the field to do their work. It took us way too long, not just at the State Department, but all across the United States government. Those are the people that can translate what the president, the constitutional elected leader of the United States, is trying to achieve on behalf of the American people, the mandate that he received. And when you don't have those people, when they're not in position all throughout the government, then those who've just been there 20 or 30 years, who may well be fine people, will move on the agenda that's the one they've been working on, or the one that they care about, and not the one that the people elected the president to achieve.
Yeah, and that gets to, you know, a conversation about the Abraham Accords. You know, John Kerry famously said, "You can't have peace in the Middle East without a." Well, let me do his voice. You can't have peace in the Middle East without a deal with Palestine, or whatever. And it's kind of, his face kind of melts off as he says it. And
that's pretty good. I gave you a B+. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it was more like a B-. It's not my best. Anyway, but it really, that quote is so indicative of the foreign policy blob of Washington, D.C., that groupthink that had occurred. And I definitely saw it in grad school. And I did international relations as an undergrad too. And there's certainly a way of thinking about things. And to walk us through, one, I guess, the resistance to those ideas, and also walk us through how much of the Abraham Accords was sort of orchestrated by the administration, how much of it was ongoing already, sort of the natural culmination of things, because I think there's a little bit of both. Yeah. Just walk us through how that went behind the scenes. I mean, the public just kind of knows it as Israel struck these great peace deals with all these Arab countries, and it just happened.
Yeah. As you know, I wish it were so. Shoot, you know, your point about the conditions having to be right, I think is true. I think the world and the Gulf states had seen for 40 years or so, maybe 50. That the Palestinians weren't prepared to accept any deal. We know they rejected multiple deals that were pretty darn good deals for them that would have made life better for the Palestinian people. So I think that baseline existed. But what in the end it took American leadership to begin to shape how those countries were prepared to take the risk, right? The risk was the one John Kerry identified wrongly, was that there'd be riots in the streets, that we'd have problems at our embassy. If we did something like move the embassy, we'd have problems in Islamabad, in Indonesia, wherever there were large Muslim populations, they'd rise up. Well, that was false. And we concluded that we could manage that risk and do a good turn for the Middle East. And so, Dan, we built out 3 pillars. One was just the unambiguous support of Israel. So we recognized the Golan Heights as the rightful property. I made a legal announcement that said basically Israel's not an occupying nation. We moved the embassy. We did all the right things to make sure that the Israelis knew that they had a good American partner. Second, the primary malign influence in the region is the republic, the regime, the theocracy of Iran. whether you go to Syria, where 6 million people have been displaced, or you have Houthis firing missiles into Saudi Arabia, or Hamas, as we've seen recently, firing rockets into Israel. Those are all Iranian-backed efforts. It is Iran that is the destabilizing force. And we walked into a situation where Obama and Biden had signed up for this deal that was a pretty crappy deal, frankly, that really didn't prevent a nuclear weapon. And so we began to put pressure on the regime in Iran with two goals. One, to convince them to change their behavior, but in the absence of that, which we knew was a tall mountain, just deny them resources so they wouldn't have billions of dollars with which to create missile programs, space programs, high-tech cyber capabilities, and ultimately a nuclear, not only a nuclear weapon, but a nuclear program. So an enormous pressure campaign on Iran. Those two things convinced the amazing leaders in Bahrain and MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates. These are amazing leaders to say enough. We're not going to have our primary foreign policy statement be the destruction of Israel. We're going to go partner with them. They're great security partners. They're great diplomatic partners. They're good fine people. They're Jewish. We're Muslim. We're going to figure out a way to make this go. And we were over time able to convince them and provide them sufficient confidence that together we could build out an understanding of how to create prosperity in the region. And it was hard work. It was remarkable. It took lots of people on our side and great leadership from these countries, Sudan, Morocco as well, to ultimately get us to a place where we had 4 countries recognize Israel, creating a better life. And last thing, Dan, I'll say is we didn't neglect the Palestinians. We want the Palestinian people to have a good life too. But when you have Abu Mazen as your leader and his primary motivating force is to steal and to loot, and who's corrupt and who has no incentive to cut a deal to recognize Israel, then you have to move on. You can't leave that you can't let that be a precondition to having better life for people throughout the rest of the Middle East.
Well, it's worth noting that, and he's the better of 2 leaders for the Palestinians, because the other one's just Hamas.
Yes, that's right. A terrorist and a criminal.
So, real quick, did you have an opinion on the new leadership in Israel?
No, I've known them a little bit, although not as well as I know Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think
does it change anything for the U.S.?
Yeah, it does. It does in this sense. Look, all Israeli leaders across the political spectrum will do the right thing to defend Israel, center mass. But the question is, when there's hard things that have to take place, this is a government that has a coalition. You got about 10% of the parliament supported Naftali Bennett, who's the prime minister, a very small minority of the Knesset. And you have leftist parties, you have Arab parties part of the coalition. That is going to make it hard to govern and more difficult for the United States when we want to work with Israel to get a decision out of the process. It's just complicated.
Yeah.
So that will create real risk. Whether this government can manage their way through this, their only unifying force is they wanted Netanyahu out. Everything else they disagree on. That's a tough way to govern. You've seen that.
It's strange. Could you imagine if we had a parliament like that in the United States? It would be chaos.
Our founders get that one right.
Yeah. Jeez. JCPOA. Can we talk about this? Which is the Iran nuclear deal? Just for everybody. The Biden administration is playing footsie with that again. What are your thoughts on how they're going to approach this?
Dan, I wish it was just footsie.
Yeah,
this has become an article of faith for the American left.
It is,
and frankly for the European left as well. And I mean, it could go on for a long time, but just as a matter that some people don't think about, the Chinese and the Russians want that deal. That should set off alarms.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we should just because China and Russia wants something doesn't mean we should reject it. But man, when they're both on that team, you should wonder whether you've been walked into a trap. Look, this deal, the administration said, Secretary Blinken said in his testimony when he was being confirmed, he said, we want to go back to a deal, but we want it to be longer and stronger. It appears the Iranians have rejected that outright, and the selection of Ibrahim Raisi to run Iran on Saturday of this week makes clear they're not going to let longer and stronger. It's going to be shorter and weaker.
Right.
There's only 9 years left on the major prohibitions on their nuclear weapons program. Imagine that. Imagine next week they announce they got a deal. We have a big ceremony, signing deal in Geneva or wherever the heck they do it. 9 years. In 9 years, Iran will have a get-out-of-jail-free card on their nuclear program. That is a blip in the moment of history. This is not in the best interest of our friend and ally Israel. It's not in the best interest of the Gulf states, and a really bad thing for the United States of America.
I think that's absolutely right. What a lot of people didn't realize was what the Iran nuclear deal did was ensure that we lost leverage in 10 to 15 years. And you know what, to understand how that is, do a simulation, and have done this before, where you play the United States and you've got some of your, somebody else playing Iran, and you look into the future 10 to 15 years when these deals expire, and the United States wants to come back to the table, because of course we do, and renegotiate it. And the Iranians say, why? Really, why? Why would we adhere to the deal and now we're good? So stay out of our business. And we have no leverage. And in the meantime, we've enriched them. They've gained more influence over the region. They've been on their ballistic missile program this entire time. So they have more leverage and we have less. And like you said, in the grand scheme of things, in the span of history, that's a blip. And I don't understand, and I like what you said about it's an article of faith, because, and this is a common amongst a lot of policy issues with the left, where they have a particular solution in mind and they're ideologically obsessed with it. So for climate change, it's like solar and wind, right? The only way must be through solar and wind, these unreliable energy sources. It can't possibly be nuclear energy. It can't possibly be natural gas, no. And it's the same with the nuclear, with Iran too. Okay, if the end goal is to not let them get a bomb, well, what other options do we have? And what's infuriating too is that they still play with this idea of a deal when it actually is clear that the maximum pressure campaign was effective. Deterrence is an effective language, and especially in the Middle East.
Then we had deterrence for 4 years. We made clear to the Iranians, you touch an American, you threaten something to our interest, and we're going to cost impose. So Qasem Soleimani was traveling from Beirut to Damascus to Baghdad. He was trying to put together an arrangement to kill Americans, and we took him from the battlefield. We sent a message to the Iranians, and by the way, to Chairman Kim, to Xi Jinping, and to others. America is going to defend the things it cares about. We're not going to let you walk all over us. This is basic. This is national security 101, right?
Right.
This administration, just as they grab the wrong end of the stick, they think if you appease the Iranians, because, oh my goodness, they're threatening to enrich to 70%. No, you created the problem by permitting them to have the centrifuges that can enrich in the first instance. I remember Secretary Kerry back in 14 and 13 saying, we're not going to let the Iranians enrich. But as soon as the Iranians put pressure on the administration, they caved, and they gave them the capacity to enrich uranium. And any nation that is like this regime, that is intent on protecting their interests through their Republican guards, their authoritarian element, you can't let them have nuclear capability. If they do, you'll have huge coercive capacity, to your point. 10 years from now in Iran, either with a weapon or on the cusp of that, will be able to command the stage. And make no mistake too, Dan, other Gulf states are watching this as well. They are not going to let Iran march down a path towards a nuclear weapon without responding. So we risk a nuclear arms race in the region as a result of the JCPOA being rejoined as well.
That's just a great point.
I've been asked to explain that, like, why would the Team Biden think this makes sense? And Dan, I often try to help people by understanding what the other side's argument is. And you can often lay it out. You just disagree, or you have different priorities. I cannot for the life of me understand how they think they're going to have leverage after they sign this deal to get them to stop their missile program or their malign terror activities in the region.
They think differently. The left off, especially in foreign policy, they often don't think in terms of leverage and incentives. They don't think in real politics. They tend to think in terms of hope and change. I mean, it was Obama's mantra, and I think that actually manifested into foreign policy. Do talk a little bit about the Soleimani strike. He was one of America's drone strike recipients, as we call them, and the less reaction to that, the media's reaction to that. I remember I was on the news quite a bit after that strike, saying, "Look, this was a good call," but they melted down over it, and of course, like in many cases, were proven wrong on it. Can you give us any backstory on how you guys came to that conclusion that was the right thing to do, and then how you dealt with the political fallout, which of course I think ended up being on the right side of?
We were very patient with the Iranians. President Trump was very patient with the Iranians. You'll recall they'd taken down an American UAV that was in international airspace. the president ultimately chose not to respond. They'd taken some shots at the embassy that I was responsible for in Baghdad. They'd harassed some of our folks in other parts of Iraq. And we responded, but in a way that was tried to create clarity and deterrence. But all the while knowing that the Iranians were under enormous pressure, right? We destroyed their foreign exchange capability, right? They were down to 10% of the foreign exchange reserves they had when we began. Now I saw their leader on Sunday announce that we took $100 billion in wealth away from them through the sanctions regime. This was crippling to the regime and was allowing the Iranian people a real chance to begin to protest and respond and against a weaker regime. But we knew that would mean that the Iranians would lash out, that there'd be some place that they would come make an effort to either distract from their problems at home or try to convince us that we needed to relieve the sanctions pressure because the cost would be too great on the United States or on Israel. We were having none of that. We then began to prepare a set of responses for the leadership. What were the kinds of things they could do? How could we be sure that we could reestablish deterrence in the event that the Iranians crossed a line we didn't want them to cross? One of those options was to make sure that we could find Iranian leadership wherever they were and prevent them from conducting an attack. And we came across that with respect to Soleimani. Dan, you know the story of him, right? He was mythical in scale and size. It's often the case we take down a terror leader and they replace him with the next guy. And there's not much change in the capabilities of them to conduct terror operations. Soleimani was a different beast, to be sure. We knew he was special. He was unique. He was a general in the IRGC that had truly become legendary within the force and within the Iranian people. And so we knew taking him down would be important, not just from a tactical perspective, stopping a particular set of plots he was working on, but would have strategic implications as well. As a result of that, you should know lots of folks inside the bureaucracy says, oh my goodness, this will be World War III. The Iranians will attack our ships. They'll conduct assassination campaigns around the world. We'll be off to the races with the Iranians. This will lead to kinetic warfare of an epic scale. We were convinced, I was certainly convinced that wouldn't be the case. And President Trump made the bold decision to take the work that we had done and respond to the Iranians in this way. We also combined it with diplomacy. We made very clear to the Iranians that this wasn't an effort to decapitate their regime, but was an effort to make clear that there were red lines for the United States of America.
To reestablish deterrence.
To reestablish deterrence. And we had communications with them. We communicated it through our friends and allies who talked to the Iranians directly as well. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it.
Yeah.
This is why we undertook this strike. They knew full well what he was up to. So when we said we know what he was doing, they said, yeah, they figured it out. They knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
So they knew too it was a legitimate strike. And so while they responded, and there were some of our service members who were injured in Iraq as a result of their response, it was pretty mild and very short-lived. And there
was a warning too. I mean, I believe, right? They warned us through the Iraqis. I think it should go down in history as a good case study in a good operation along these lines. We have so limited time. I really want to shift to China, and keep it broad, I suppose at first. But like I said, our 5-year plan with China, our 10-year plan, our 50-year plan. A lot of the issues, and I divide this into two pillars here: the economic war with China. Mm-hmm. Maybe war is a strong word, but I certainly think they feel that way. So maybe we should also look at it that way. And then military capability, the rush to military dominance. And I think the Chinese are in this unique position. Well, not unique. Everybody's in this position where all they have to do is worry about our weaknesses. See, our military has to worry about the global order. We are the global order, and I think we should remain that way. But the Chinese don't think that way. They just need to build one missile that can take out a carrier, and that's a difficult problem to deal with an aggressive rising regime. How should we think about this?
So Dan, you hit on the central challenge of our times, the Chinese Communist Party. You're pointing about war. I think it's very fair. If you just listen to Xi Jinping and the leaders around him, they declared economic warfare on us a couple of decades ago, and we basically rolled over. Yeah. We basically followed the policy from 1972 of constructive engagement. You talk about the Washington blob, this enormous political financial community that has deep roots in China, and the relationship with China couldn't see that the leadership in China changed its view and became aggressive. And we sat on it. All of the West, not just the United States, Europe too, the Australians, the Japanese, South Koreans, everybody just kind of tolerated China. We had exceptions for them in everything we did. There was one set of rules for the world, and then we had the China exception. President Trump came in and said, enough, I'm not going to let that happen anymore. And so began to confront it economically with the trade policies. And then we began to build a military that could respond in a way that would confront the Chinese Communist Party without raising the risk that there would be an actual kinetic conflict. And then I want to talk about the space between those two. So one piece is economic, the other military. In the space between them is what I'll call the tech sector, the information warfare space, which has a commercial component and a military component. We draw a sharp distinction between the two. The Chinese recognize no such thing, and that gives them an enormous advantage. Anyone who's dealing with a Chinese company should know that they are being touched by the Chinese Communist Party. There is no separation between private sector and their military apparatus. They are one and the same. And that has real connotations for how we think about 5 and 50 years for the United States. We began to build out the architecture. So getting our friends and allies to understand this threat as well, right? Talking about the risk to our technology sector from companies like ZTE and Huawei and Tencent and Baidu, talking about intellectual property theft and how we might respond to this in a way that for the first time actually preserved the good hard work that people do all across America to create and innovate. And then we built out an alliance system that was preparing to work against the Chinese Communist Party in a way that the world began to work against the Soviet Union back in the 1980s.
Right.
This is a very serious matter. It will take a lot of thought and a lot of work across multiple administrations. And I pray that this becomes bipartisan because it will take that much time and we'll need people all across the political spectrum to recognize this risk.
Yeah, it's strange because it's kind of bipartisan, but for some reason it's not as much as it could be. And so, I mean, what should we be investing in? Is it more ships? Is it a bigger Navy? Do we need to reimagine our capabilities the way the Chinese do? Is it Space Force? Is it looking to that next generation of military deterrence and that next technological innovation that puts the Chinese in their place and stops them from this kind of belligerent behavior? I think the alliances are extremely important, of course. Is it more in the intelligence community? I mean, or is it all of the above? Which is probably the answer.
It's likely all of the above, and I'll leave the details to smarter minds than mine with respect to the actual military capabilities we need. But you do have to reimagine what we're doing. Dan, for 20 years now, we're all coming up on the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. Our military was focused. CENTCOM was the deal. It got the resources. We were fighting the counterterror campaign. That was appropriate. We've done remarkable work. The intelligence community's done great work. The military's done great work. Our civil systems have done good work. And frankly, our alliances have provided a network to take down terror plots all across the world. We get an A. It's now time to go confront this behemoth, this Chinese Communist Party. We need to do it together. So this will take first a set of defensive actions. I'll give you an example. In your home state of Texas, the Chinese were conducting deep spying operations out of the diplomatic facility in Houston.
In my district,
This was permitted to go on for an awfully long time. And finally, Director Wray and I said, enough. We made the case, the president signed off. We shut it down. And there was a cost. They closed down one of our consulates in China, so be it. We couldn't move. We couldn't go. I mean, it was crazy imbalanced. And we need to go create and impose real cost on China that are parallel and reciprocal. And if we begin to do that and build out alliances with the Indians, right, 1.4 billion people in India who went to war with China last year. Don't forget, in the Himalayas, the Chinese killed a couple of dozen of Indian citizens with pipes and barbed wire. It's a real war in the Himalayas at 20,000 feet. We need to go build out alliances with these democratic systems, these economic powers. And when we do, we can begin to convince the Chinese people, some 900 million plus Chinese people who aren't connected to the Communist Party, who just want a better life. We can convince them that, there's a better path forward, and we can impose real costs in a way that will deter the Chinese from what they've been getting away with both economically and militarily for the last 40 years.
So you can cut me off if you want, because I know your time it might be limited. But I have one more question. I'm trying to. I'd love to ask you.
Of course.
And it's the politics of foreign policy, domestic politics of foreign policy, and the Americans, left and right, were very tired with ongoing wars, very tired with our occupations and nation building, especially. Now, I think that went too far. I think that fatigue with nation building was probably righteous fatigue, but it turned into, we can't even have anybody out there because it's just wrong. And it's wrong because I say it's wrong, and endless wars are bad. Now, I think it's more complicated than that. But what worries me, though, is that the reaction is so severe that it has culminated over the last 20 years that we might be out of balance with our citizens' perception of foreign policy, where it's like we shouldn't be anywhere, and that isolationism has become way too strong and veered too far from a reasonable conversation about costs and benefits for being in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. That's how I think about it. And I think if you send people like me over there as an insurance policy, I don't think about it like we're trying to win a war. I'm an insurance policy. I go target bad guys so that they don't have the operational freedom to target you at home. And that's an ongoing operation that might last a long time. And that's how I see it. But that trigger point is very emotional for people. And I worry that we won't be able to do what we need to do abroad anymore. I mean, you saw it in December, that last bill we passed, and people were losing their minds because there was foreign aid attached to a COVID bill. And then, I mean, that was frustrating. And it was like, this was President Trump's, he went against it, but like, this is his presidential request. I was very frustrated by that as somebody voted for it.
I totally get it.
But that's the kind of visceral reaction you see. So what do you tell people?
I tell them, Dan, exactly what you just described. Is that the mission set for our foreign policy has to be singular, protecting American interest, right? President Trump shortened that to America first. We should be unambiguous about that.
Mm-hmm.
But the best way to do that from time to time is to make sure we have people in the right places at the right moment to go take down bad guys in the same way we took down Qasem Soleimani, right? That mission was enabled by the fact that we had forces in the region that could both identify and collect the intelligence capability to understand the problem set.
I personally know the guys on the ground who were doing that.
Of course. Yeah. By the way, I probably didn't do justice. Amazing operation. Can't say much about it, but my goodness, if you want to talk about elite forces performing excellent work, this was something every American.
People wrongly believe that it's just as simple as flying a drone around and you can just find bad guys. It doesn't work that way.
Oh my goodness. This was, and by the way, nobody in the world could execute that mission besides the United States military. Nobody. To operate, conduct a mission like that, thousands of miles from your homeland, there's only one military in the world that can pull that off. It's a complicated, the backstory. Make no mistake, this is complex systems, processes, and amazing people and really good leaders making really good decisions. But back to this issue. Dan, leaders have to talk about this in a way that's sensible and reasonable and defend the things that keep us safe. President Trump in Afghanistan and in the Middle East would say to me, Mike, I just have two things I want you to do. I want you to make sure in Afghanistan we don't ever have a terror act come from that land again, and I want you to get everybody back. And so we began to try and develop, I was the state secretary of state, not the secretary of defense, a diplomatic effort to enable us to increase the likelihood we could achieve each of those two objectives. But it takes having resources in places around the world in the right numbers and the right structure with the right capabilities to make sure that we don't have folks coming at us from abroad. I think, Dan, I'll close with this thought. We talk about our southern border. You all live that in Texas every day. And the fact that drugs come across there and human trafficking is all really bad. But this is the first time we've ever had ungoverned space on our southern border. We talk about ungoverned space in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Syria and say, this is a place bad guys can gather to begin to build out terror plots. The Mexican government's capacity to control where these cartels are operating along our southern border is incredibly limited. have to be serious about making sure we understand how to protect even our southern border. And Attorney General Barr and I had begun to think about, what do you do when you have transnational criminal organizations like these cartels sitting on your border, not 8,000 miles away or 4,000 miles away? How do you make sure that how do you have this right? These are the kinds of risks that we need to make sure that we talk to the American people about in a way that is sensible and logical. And when we do, I'm convinced they will be fully supportive of the institutions that need to go execute these missions.
Yeah, we could talk about I think the need to pivot south with our foreign policy for
Right.
quite a bit. I mean, it's our backyard. You've got a fairly like-minded Western civilization, predominantly Catholic, ripe for development and prosperity and alliances and a security threat, like you talked about, that I think deserves maybe more American attention. Okay, well, but I know you got to go. We could talk about that forever. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being on. It's great. This is a great conversation.
You bet. We'll do it again. So long.
Bye.